Epicurus. But the Romans did do that, and they did think of it as based on Epicurus's philosophy, so they clearly misinterpreted what Epicurus recommended as the best life. He didn't mean that you should just overindulge constantly to just have extreme fun and so on. But instead he wanted a long, moderate kind of life, you know. He's even apparently against certain things like shellfish and other odd foods, as his recommendation was that you eat a normal kind of, you habituate yourself to a regular kind of diet that you know will keep you healthy and so on. So Epicurus, quite interesting. Often I'll ask, like in an ancient philosophy course, of all the different philosophers, who would you pick as a guide to a happy life? A lot of people pick Epicurus. Not the way the Romans did, but rather, and especially in Alaska, I think it reminds me of the bush life. The folks that want to have a happy life, but they want a family life. They want to have stuff, good food. They want to raise children, and so on. But they really hate being in a urban environment. And so instead of living, say, in Anchorage, they have a cabin out. Even if they just go out occasionally. Seth Kantner strikes me as an individual that's pretty much like that. He lives out near Teller, and he was raised out there under the tundra. I mentioned his book last week, Ordinary Wolves. He's got quite a few books, actually. He talks about what, as a kid, with the caribou on the roof of his father. I think they didn't actually make the underground dwelling. However, they found one and fixed it up or something, as far as I recall. But his father was a history professor. His mother was also a university professor, and they got disgruntled with life in Kansas or wherever it was they were, and so they moved and set up home out under the tundra, and just did everything on their own. So in a way, it strikes me as basically this kind of Epicurean philosophy that does that. So they're trying to be happy, but avoiding the stresses of everyday life as best as possible, and yet still having all the things of everyday life. And then the next one over, as I'm moving in what I feel is kind of a logical progression, because you're adding more potential stresses to it, would be the Stoic philosophy. There are lots of good Roman examples. St. Augustine is considered a Stoic, Christian Stoic, so you can have Christian Stoics as well. But the Stoic, the name comes from the stoa, the porch. So if you look at the columns out in the front of those majestic buildings, that's a stoa. And Zeno the Stoic taught his students out on one of those porches, so they became known as the Stoics. And the main thing that a Stoic is going to do, they're going to live in the city. They're going to have jobs running the city, especially in the military. The military is considered a prime situation for the Stoic philosophy. And the main virtue of a Stoic is doing your duty to the community. So if you're in the military, doing what you're ordered to do is basically the main the main goal of the Stoic. but why? You know, if you think that they're still trying to avoid the stresses that come with life and have a happy life, a post-Aristotelian happy life, and for the most part, you can tell that there's a sense that this life is all there is. So they're not, Diogenes is definitely not trying to go to heaven by living a particular type of life. Epicurus, the same. This is it, right? And so, you know, trying to have the happiest type of life in a very physical sense. And by the way, as a metaphysician, Epicurus was also an atomist. So basically everything is made up of atoms, which swerve. There's even a book called The Swerve, which is about Diogenes Laerces, the author that we get stuff about Epicurus from, also wrote a book called De Rerum Natura, D-E, Rerum Natura, is basically about nature. And that book, when it was rediscovered in the late Middle Ages, is considered by some to be one of the triggers that started the scientific revolution. It's very evolutionary in nature. But the Stoics argue that in order for you to live the good life, you have to live in, and this is Aristotle, you have to live in a good city, and you have to live in a good neighborhood, and you have to be raised by good parents that raise you properly, and then you're going to be able to have a good life. If you're living in Baltimore in the slum, and your mom is raising you by yourself with no father figure in the house, plus you're living in a community where if you step outside you're going to get shot unless you're part of a gang that might help protect you until your late 20s, which would be your life expectancy in that kind of a town. You're not going to be able to get a job unless you're a drug dealer. You know, I'm talking like Ta-Nehisi Coates, the way he describes the way he had to grow up, right? Yes? You familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Nope, but it sounds all like Chicago's.
This is, well, it's Baltimore. Did I say Chicago?
No.
Ta-Nehisi Coates. He is a very popular author. I haven't read The Water Dancer, but I've read a couple of his books. The Water Dancer must be his newest one. I don't know. I'm looking for one that I've read, but I'll just click on any of these videos here. Well, that wasn't a video. Okay, I'll go back to just Wikipedia. So he's born and raised in Baltimore. His books are mostly about the life in those kinds of communities and how absolutely unable people are to break out of those kinds of communities because of the nature of how absolutely no opportunities exist for anybody in those areas. Oddly, he's a millionaire now with all of his books. So one of his books. One of the books he wrote was about Obama's presidency. We were in power 8 years, I think was the title of it. Between the World and Me was one about his growing up. We were 8 years in power, so that was his book about Obama's 8 years in presidency. And he's saying we, meaning blacks, were in power, as Obama was. He was very disappointed, though, in how little Obama accomplished. In any case, if you are going to live a good life, you can't live in a slum in Baltimore. You have to live in one of the, well, how about this? We could pick one of the super zips. You live in a super zip. Which we want?
Super zip code?
Does that mean like affluence?
A super zip. Okay, so if you live in a super zip, that means everyone in the neighborhood
Codes.
has millionaire status or above.
Jeez.
They all, both husband and wife, and everyone's married. You don't have any single parents. You instead have families with married, and both married man and woman have gone to either Harvard or Yale or both, have been to both, depending, right? So, right, these are the stats on that.
650.
And they're not, it's not a gated community, because they're such a large community with such great distances between the houses and everything that nobody needs gates, because you don't have to worry about people wandering off into your, so if you want to live in a super zip, the things you need is for everyone to get married and stay married. You also have to work very industriously all your life. You have to be honest. And you have to go to church every Sunday. And it doesn't matter which church, as long as you go to that church every Sunday. Being part of a community is what's important, right? So the term super zip was originally coined by Charles Murray in one of his books.
It's 120 grand, says here.
Combined. Yeah.
Right, but you have to already have millions besides. That's your income per year.
Are you talking about the
Net worth
statistical
has to be
placement?
millions.
You're talking about to fall under the label that he created.
For
you
these
have to have
neighborhoods.
these-
And there are such neighborhoods, and you could go on, these maps will let you know. By the way, there is none in Alaska. We do not have such a
Really?
neighborhood in Alaska. Sorry about that.
We only have one zip code.
No, we have one area code, we have a bunch of zip codes.
Oh, yeah, you're right. I was thinking
Here's,
907.
You can find, there are 20 super zips where America's ultra elite reside, and there they are.
North Carolina,
So that's pretty cool.
little dot on the border of South Carolina. North Carolina's where a lot of the CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies live, right there. Try it.
But so those are the characteristics that you need. They have to be industrious, they have to be honest, have to marry and stay married, because if you break up, then the kids are all screwed up and it screws up your wealth and all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying this is by his
By Charles Murray.
definition, Charles Murray. So that's, but where it ties into Stoicism is the idea that you have to live in a good community, the best. The better the community, the better the opportunities for you, for your family, for your children. But you can't just live there without putting yourself into obligation to the community, Because in order for that community to be the best or to be good, you have to help. You have obligations to participate, vote, be gainfully employed, not steal from your neighbors. All those obligations that mean that you have to go to committee meetings. And if you've ever been in committee meetings or boards and sat in on boards, some of the most boring ways to spend your day is sitting at a board meeting and listening to all the idiots that you have to listen to. You know, you have to be polite and you have to let everyone have their say, even though you're absolutely, I mean, let's face it, we get some real idiotic. If you've ever gone to the assembly meeting on Tuesday evenings and watched some of the folks that have their opportunity to speak, etc. And if, by the way, if you're a member of the assembly and you say something nasty to somebody who's being an idiot, it turns out not to be good for you. So you have to be polite. You know, we've had, you know, some of our own folks from Eagle River that have been on the assembly and have criticized people that, you know, just keep droning on and on, you know, saying the same dumb things. You have to be polite to those folks. So this is boring. So it's very stressful being a Stoic in your capacity of doing your duty for your community and so on. So along with that focus on duty, Stoics also have a traditional character, and that is that they're stoic, right? Think how the word is used, right? That stuff goes on and you just kind of cold-faced, not being moved by the stupidity, not being too absolutely, you know, thrilled and so on. I think of one of the great Stoics, Epictetus, was a member of Nero's council, and I think pretty much ran the government for Nero. Nero wasn't really running the government. He was just partying and so on. So somebody had to actually be running the government because it was still pretty efficient then. And so Epictetus was probably not only teaching Stoicism but also running a lot of the government at the time. So that's, you know, and so and you use Stoicism yourself. Say, for example, if you're driving down the Glen Highway and some car, I'm going to assume it's a teenage or that age young man who's obviously loaded with testosterone and feels like cutting everybody off because he's so important. He has to get where he's going. Heck with the speed limits, etc. So he's cutting everybody off, and he cuts off you, right? And you're driving along, and as soon as that happens, don't you get like can you even feel the adrenaline going, you know, squirt, right? You actually feel it. Have you ever been in that situation where and it burns actually when you feel the adrenaline all of a sudden, you know, and you know, you go crazy. The most amazing experience I had that way in traffic was in Hawaii. I was on the H1 driving to my retirement briefing. And as I'm driving on the 3 lanes with concrete walls on both sides, and it's 55 miles an hour, and Mauka showers, so kind of wet, right? And as you're driving along, 55 miles an hour means I'm going, 60, 65, right? And I'm driving a Ford Aerostar, which you ever seen the stats? The van, the Ford Aerostar van. If you've ever seen the stats on that, stopping distances, you know, when they have the chart, you know, normal cars, you know, their stopping distance here, 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 and the Ford Aerostar's stopping distance is here, right? Terrible, as far as, you know, it's just built not to stop, basically. And right in front of me, I was in the middle lane with cars on either side of me. And in the middle lane, ahead of me, a woman, Oriental woman, in a black Volvo sedan, spun sideways and sat there with shock on her face. And I was about 100 yards away. And I said to myself, I'm going to die. Because there's no way to go. There's no way this machine that I'm in is going to stop in that short a distance. In fact, I don't think I even put on the brake. Figured this is it. But then just before I hit her, I thought to myself, you're better off hitting someone that's going the same speed that you are instead of someone that's stationary. So I decided I would hit the guy on my left instead of her. So just before I hit her, I spun to the left. And at exactly that time, the guy next to me, with no room, I don't know how he managed it, he went to the left. The two of us did a perfect S around the car we were like this on both sides, came out the other side. He and I looked at one another and went, and then I shook like crazy because I was just so loaded with this adrenaline that, you know, we're okay, we're okay. But it took me all the way to Kenia to calm down. And I still remember it. It's just locked into my memory because that was such a... But do you get mad at that person? No. Do you want to cut them off? You know, if you've been cut off, do you want to race?
It takes a
No.
second to get to that part of the chemical loop.
You know that what you really want to do is keep calm, use self-control, right? And get where you're going safely instead of getting even, right? And you can do it. You can tell yourself things like, that idiot is going to be in the ditch in just a couple miles, so I'll probably pass him upside down, you know, and I'll wave. You know? Maybe. Although you don't want to rubberneck, right?
Right, because that's not the Stoic way.
No. But, you know, so the Stoic, you know, you keep calm, collected. You know. I think Yoda is probably a perfect example. If you think, where did George Lucas get the idea for criticizing Annie or any of the others for, you know, getting too emotional about something? That's a Stoic philosophy. I know you could argue that maybe it's an Oriental Zen kind of philosophy that maybe he used for that. It probably mixed those, but yeah. So Stoics, pretty good that way. I totally lost. I'm almost done my little post-Aristotelian chart. So we get Epictetus is a great example there. Marcus Aurelius is another. That's kind of interesting because Epictetus was a slave and Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. So it's one of the things they point out that the Stoic philosophy, the Romans used it from top to bottom in their whole structure. Although Epictetus was, even though he was a slave, he also eventually got his freedom. He was an educated person, and so on. He's the one that was, I mentioned him as being in Nero's cabinet, right? He's the one, not Epicurus. Epicurus was a Greek in Athens. Epictetus, though, was. And remember, St. Augustine is also considered to be Stoic. But then, shoot. So Platonism is still around, and in fact they refer to it as neo. Just means new. And along with St. Augustine, we could also put Plotinus. Plotinus, who was from Alexandria, Egypt. Plotinus. But St. Augustine we could also put here.
Which one?
This is the one in Hippo, the Bishop of Hippo.
Yeah, I think of it as Augustine. Saint Augustine.
I've heard his name pronounced Augustine, Augustine. I've heard it different ways. The priests that I had in the faculty in my high school were Augustinians, Order of OSA, Order of St. Augustine. Okay, so this is basically the post-Aristotelians. There's one other, the skeptics, which you could put pretty much anywhere, I suppose. Skeptics believed in being part of the community, but at the same time, they kind of avoided arguing about what they thought was true with regard to metaphysics and ethics and so on, because they thought that arguing about philosophy was one of the things they wanted to avoid in order to live a happy life, right? So they're skeptics. Okay, so I guess that's. But notice that as I move from right to left, looking at it this way, what you see is a gradual increase in adding the community to what you think of as your happiness, right? So you have more obligations as you go to the community. In fact, as you get to the far left, which then Plotinus, one of his teachers was a Christian, Ammonius Saccas. I think I can even find him. He was one of Plotinus's teachers, and he was a Christian. So Neoplatonism. And so St. Augustine we also refer to as a Platonist, as a Christian. And we'll talk about that when we have the chance, talking about Augustine or Augustine. Okay. So when we're looking at the text and thinking about any good quotes you might find there, there's this. A couple of good underlines. No age is too early or too late for the health of the soul. That's page 645. Accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to us, for good and evil imply awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness. So death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are alive, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not alive. Reading this, though, it occurred to me to think about Sylvia Plath as one example, because I've just finished with Malcolm Gladwell's Speaking to Strangers, I think is the title of his new book. Talking to Strangers, something like that. But there's a interesting section in one of the, like chapter 5 or 6, where he's talking about Sylvia Plath. If you're familiar with her, Sylvia Plath committed suicide. Yes, she's considered a genius author, and wrote a lot about suicide. And what Malcolm Gladwell talks about is how what England discovered when they switched from the kind of gas that they used when she committed suicide to natural gas was that the suicide rate was cut in half. And so Malcolm Gladwell refers to this as, what's the word he used? Coupling. I usually use the word coupling for other things, but coupling in this context is that you have the right kind of environment for a particular kind of activity. And in this case, there were so many women in England that were committing suicide the same way, by killing themselves with the gas, one way or the other. And by the way, Malcolm Gladwell also points out that in our society, I think most men kill themselves that do with a handgun. Is that right? Does that sound familiar? No? Yes?
Yeah, no, I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, men are more likely to use like a handgun, some sort of weapon, and then women are more likely to OD.
Which is not as successful, apparently.
Do you know if there's like a percentage of where they say where, like, you know, when you say geniuses commit suicide, it seems like there's I don't know, I can't say most people, but the super, super smart people, end up committing suicide. I wonder if at one point in time they just, the knowledge is too much. I don't know. It seems like there's quite a few of them that.
Well, I guess it depends on the type of genius.
Right.
And so poets that are geniuses tend to, I think, have more difficulties that way. Mathematicians, on the other hand, tend to be less social, but I think of Kurt Gödel. The only thing that killed him was he was afraid of food, so he starved to death.
All food? I didn't
Well,
know
his wife was the only one that could really feed him, and she died. And so he ended up, for a while, Einstein tried to help him out, but he eventually ended up being, just wasted away, like 75 pounds or something, and died.
I didn't know that.
Kurt Gödel?
Yeah, that whole. Was it because he had extreme allergies just for some reason?
No. He thought that the Nazis were trying to kill him
So he was a little.
because he thought that they thought he was Jewish, even though he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
He was paranoid. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, a little paranoid. Okay.
He was the only other one besides Einstein that was living in that math retreat on Princeton, Math Institute, that Princeton created. In fact, the reason Einstein was there is because Gödel was there.
Yeah.
That's kind of.
Yeah. I guess I'm not saying that they usually commit suicide, but it seems like they do end up going crazy at one point in time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, crazy in the sense that they're not like normal people.
crazy in the sense that, yeah, become paranoid, thinks the government's after them, thinks they're seeing things, and, you know, super, super paranoid. Like, I have an uncle who's, like, super smart. He speaks, like, 18 languages, but he's, you know, definitely loony sometimes, because he thinks, you know, everyone's being spied on, everyone's after him to get something, or, you know, just, it seems like when they're up there in the smart level, they eventually kind of.
But the reason Malcolm Gladwell picks on Sylvia Plath wasn't because he wants to do an expose on Sylvia Plath or anything.
Right.
What he's talking about, though, is this coupling that you know. By the way, he also talks about the police and pulling over different people. It's actually quite an interesting book. If you're what was it? Talking to strangers or speaking to strangers? Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've,
Talking to strangers.
was it on there?
Yeah.
Talking?
Mm-hmm.
Talking to strangers. Yeah, this one. It's quite interesting. But so the whole bit about coupling is that, you know, how statistically we kind of focus on specific characteristics and think, aha, you know, this is how do we solve crimes? Well, we need a lot more police so that they could be all over the town. But what actually turns out to be statistically accurate is that crime hangs out in specific places. And so you only need to increase the police presence in those places. And then it's not like, oh, then they'll move somewhere else. No. Turns out that when you put all the police in that place, crime goes away entirely. They don't move somewhere else. You know, there's something coupling that behavior with that particular spot. And you know, that's and like with Sylvia Plath, it was discovering that all these British women were killing themselves because there was a modus operandi that made it easy and clean and neat. Sylvia Plath put a nice little tea cozy on her oven and lay her head nicely as far in the oven as she could get and turn the gas on. She put all the rags under the door so the gas wouldn't get to her children. She had the window open for her children so they wouldn't be gassed, etc. So she did it beautifully, you know. But the thing was, she tried suicide often and was like practicing, in a sense, getting it right. And all the writing that she was writing about it, it was, the way he explains it is pretty interesting, that what she seems to be, she's fascinated with committing suicide and doing it a certain way, and not just that, you know, she suddenly wanted to commit suicide and jump off a bridge or something. Same thing with the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. You know, all the people that would be jumping off of that, it took all these years, and they finally believed these statistics, and they put a net along the side of the place where the people had been jumping off, and guess what? Suicides off the bridge have been halved, or something like that. So, and that's another example, though, of this kind of coupling between. It was really romantic to kill yourself jumping off of that bridge. There are other bridges. But no, they're not as attractive, so you don't have as many people killing themselves off of other bridges.
I wonder where they figured out where to put the net, because you could just pop out of the net and then still die. I guess it would be less graceful to be like, boing, flop, splat. But, like,
Gives you that second chance of a thought, like, maybe this isn't really what I want.
right?
So they put a net there?
They put a net that's just strong enough to break all your limbs so you can't get
Oh.
out of the net on your own.
So if you look at this picture, can you see the net right there?
Oh.
Oh, yeah, you can do that with a good run. Clear that sucker. Come on, Sylvia, practice your long jump. Sandpit that thing for a month.
Oh my gosh.
You can look at the picture.
So because so many
there's-
people jump
Parkour,
off
'cause you gotta
now?
like up
Clear
and
the
run,
ground.
up over, you gotta get up over the ledge to then like try to be able to clear the netting. It's
So
just-
because so many people
Just
try
bounce
to
forward.
jump, commit
They put the
suicide.
net there.
Just jump
Bounce.
off the net.
Now they
Wow.
can't.
Really?
I don't think,
I've never
What?
heard of this.
I read his
Like,
book
tension
and
going
that's
down the
Yeah.
what he
net.
said.
If it's
and
not got a lot of tension on it, like I don't think you're gonna really
Wow.
bounce off.
That would have been like a real shocker. You jump off thinking you're gonna die, and then that first jumper. You're like, what the?
I just wish
Who put this here?
you could have put springs on the net and angled it back towards the bridge so that it puts you back on the bridge.
I looked at it and I thought, okay, so I jump off, I land in the net. You know what? You could just
You can still.
and still jump off the edge of the net,
Absolutely.
right?
But yeah, like you said, maybe at that point you're like, maybe this is my second chance. I won't do it again or something. Jeez.
That's the testimony of one person who actually jumped off and hit the water and survived. Now he's
Yeah.
an advocate for suicidal ideation to try to keep people from doing it. Because he survived.
However, suicide is a serious issue, and I don't want anyone to complain that I'm making light of suicide. As chances are, folks here have friends that committed suicide. My cousin shot himself in the head a couple years ago. He was expecting to have a very painful surgery soon, and he decided he'd rather not. So I'm still mad at him
Yeah.
because I was expecting that we would have lots of time to do things together, and of course now we can't. Not to mention all his family and everything. Okay. So Descartes, we haven't talked about this section here, and this section is where he talks about his argument that the body and the mind are two separate things. And part of that comes from the argument that he knows for sure that he exists, cogito ergo sum, remember his famous argument, I think, therefore I am. But the result of that argument isn't that he knows he exists, he knows his mind exists. He still has doubts about the connection his mind has with his body. And so as you were reading that, did you notice how he very carefully talks about how there's different aspects to his thinking, his imagination is slightly different, his perceptions and so on. A very interesting discussion about how if he's the pilot of a ship. Oh, wait a minute. Was that the next one? Are you thinking of him or
Oh, you're thinking
who was talking about the pilot of the ship?
The next story after God is dead. Reading.
Oh, am I? I
Yeah.
gotta watch. Oh no, he does. Right here.
Yes?
Rene Descartes talks about, this is page 268. He says that I'm not only lodged in my body as a pilot in a vessel, but that I am besides so intimately conjoined and as it were intermixed with it that my mind and body compose a certain unity. So I am one with my body, and yet my mind is still something separate from my body. The thing is, like, if a pilot is piloting a ship and it hits the dock or something, which happens here in Alaska, even if it's a big commercial cruise line. It could actually destroy $1 million dock. Was that Sitka, right? It just, oops, and crunkle. $1 million worth of dock. Pretty embarrassing, I suppose. But that's different than when I burn my finger on a stove or something, right? Because the pilot can see that the ship is getting damaged, but it doesn't affect the pilot of the ship in the same way that when you bang yourself, like you hit your head on something, right? That's a very different connection than the pilot of the ship. So the mind or soul of us is not connected to our body the way a pilot is connected in a ship, Descartes argues, but instead there's a much more closer connection. But he still argues that there is this somewhat different aspect in which I exist as a mind that's different than the body. And so that's kind of intriguing. And when we go on and look at Chalmers, David Chalmers, talking about virtual reality, that adds still another aspect to this kind of an interesting difference. And I don't know if you had a chance to listen to Chalmers. I was talking with Catherine before class got started because I had this running, and I said to her that after you've watched this video 2 or 3 times, it begins to make more sense. You know, the first time you're like, what is he talking about? You know, the mirror. You know. So if you're driving your car and you're looking at your rear view mirror and you see cars in the rear view mirror, that mirror is ahead of you. So in one sense, it looks like those cars are ahead of you, but you know that those cars are behind you. That because of the way the mirror works, you're aware that that's behind you, right? So phenomenologically, he says, you know that it's behind you. And then he goes on to talk about, the new cameras that a lot of people have in their cars so that you can see what's behind you when you're backing up, right? It's kind of like a rear view mirror, but maybe not as intuitively useful the way a mirror is. If you're used to how mirrors work, you have to kind of get used to how those cameras work. But then he moves still further and he starts talking about stuff like this, but especially virtual reality when he talks about wearing the Oculus Rift and stuff like that. Pretty interesting. But the issues, the philosophical issues, are similar to what Descartes' parsing in this particular article. So that's where I see that connection, that when we're trying to figure out where the different aspects of our thought are. And we know today that we do have different parts of our brain, the amygdala, the cerebellum, I don't know all the names, medulla oblongata, etc. Anybody know all the hippocampus?
Colossal.
Yeah, the hippocampus, but we don't have an elephantanus, right? We just, that was a terrible joke.
Does Chalmers talk about like synaptic adaptation to spatial experience in this? Like your brain changing to interpret virtual reality as reality?
Yes. He didn't call it synaptic. He didn't talk about synapses. The only time he talked about the synapses is when he was shooting them in a game. There's a game where
so what's his
this is where he's talking about
thesis?
Well, it seems to you that someone has a sunset out there through the
his,
mirror, maybe through the road.
make sure I get.
Well, for a long time, I think that's merely a consequence of the current state of technology, and as we get more and more.
Okay, that's questions.
Okay, we have 30 minutes for questions. Please raise your hand, and I will
so this is the screen where his, oh, too far. Oh, here's where he's shooting the synapses. But that's a virtual reality.
A little bit like Fantastic Voyage, but inside VR. This is a game where you've got to go through a brain, and you can see there's a whole bunch of diseased neurons inside the brain. You've got to spot the diseased neurons and focus your laser on them and shoot.
That's, this is already a couple years old, by the way. This is 2015. And he had an early edition of the Oculus Rift that hadn't yet been available to the public, that he was using to spark his, in fact, he's in a couple of studios where they put him in a suit with all the different sensors and everything. In fact, in one of them he says he was dressed in the suit with all the sensors, but they gave him a female body. So he says he's looking down at his pointy feet, and must have been pretty strange. Now I haven't tried it with anything that gives me a different body, except well, there was one. Let me see if I can. There was one game that I got. Shoot, that's not going to work. I need to be up here. Need to go.
So where was Chalmers going with that talk? Like his
So he's arguing that virtual reality is reality. Even so there's a way, just as when you know that you're looking at a mirror, you're not seeing like directly, you're seeing a reflection. But we know that. But the reflection is real. What we see is real. We're experiencing something that's real. We're looking at him giving a lecture. Obviously, he's given that lecture way back in 2015, but we can watch it and listen to him as if he's right there. But we know the difference. We know that that's a video on YouTube, right? That you're seeing through the projector on a screen, that David Chalmers is not really there, and yet it's absolutely real in the sense. So virtual doesn't mean that it's less real. It's just real in a different sense, right? Because what you're looking at is a projection on a screen, right?
digital reality.
Right. So that's his overall argument, is that it's not virtual in the sense that it's not real. It is real, of course, but it's real projection, it's real digital, it's real, through the Oculus, etc. That kind of thing.
Well, I guess like when you put yours on, like you say, you can go see any place that you want to in the comfort of your
Yes.
living room. So if you're visiting Paris, Paris surely is real, but it's just not really in front of you at the
I'm
moment.
not really in Paris.
Yeah.
I'm looking at pictures that are surrounding me that
Yeah.
makes me feel like
You're there.
I'm walking on a street in Paris.
Yeah. So
But
it's
if I'm
real,
not
but
paying
it's not
attention to what's really in front of my feet, I'll trip over my Saint Bernard,
Yeah.
which isn't in the video, right?
Yeah.
But neither am I falling through space, which, so this is another video I made with that camera, looking at my laptop at home when I was so this is based on that movie, Coco. There is music and everything, and in fact Coco's talking to you, but notice my camera was not able to pick up what was in my headsets. But so in this particular game, you end up becoming a dead body. Does that make sense? So like my hand, when I reach up and I hold my hand, what I'm looking at is bones.
What
Is that
is
you
it?
in the
What
mirror?
is this?
That's me, in fact, in the mirror. That's the way I'm dressed right now. Everybody in this world is, this is like the movie.
Oh, there's your hand.
Okay.
See,
But how
those
are
are
you,
my
how are you
hands.
able to do that? What is this? Sorry, I'm not as
I have hand controllers in my hands and,
And
the-
this is through your,
right.
and there's a game that you were doing in there?
I guess you would call it, it's a game, but it's really more of an advertisement for the movie.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Is it Disney? This is
Yes.
Disney, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
I'm just asking because it makes cool Christmas presents, whatever it is that it is, assuming, you know, it's affordable, but yeah. That would be a cool Christmas present for,
oh,
A
this
kid.
is cool.
to like be able to, because they have them for like Jurassic Park or,
Well, I'm sure there's,
so this is just a virtual reality set that you had on?
Right.
It's cool. We went to one in Anchorage.
in the
Um,
museum.
They have one in museum?
They had, for a while, they had a couple of sets in the big atrium in the museum where they had something going on where you could see stuff.
Oh, this one was an escape room. They have an escape room as well as a virtual reality room, and you can put one on and you could, and that's where I've experienced the jumping off and, you know, as if you're falling through the sky type of thing, so.
Exactly. Yeah, you could do all that at home with these. I
Huh,
love going out into space and,
wow, you really, you could do all that? And it's just something you bought at Best Buy?
I did buy this.
It's called
at Best-
Oculus?
The computer I use on it, I bought at the PX
Okay,
on base.
Okay.
But they have all of that stuff at Best Buy. But I bought it at the PX because it was a couple $100 cheaper.
so it comes, so you have to do it through a computer?
The Oculus Rift has plugs that you have to plug into a special laptop that's virtual, VR ready.
Okay,
And so like this one is not. It doesn't have the ports to plug it in.
so it's called Oculus what?
Oculus Rift.
Right. Okay, look it up.
So,
Yeah, I'm not that high tech, we're still in the just Wii
but
and
you could
Xbox.
go all over. By the way, there's plenty of music. There's a band down on the stage playing as if you're at a Mexican town.
Have you seen this movie?
No,
It's really good,
but I've played this.
yeah.
And you go all around. There's all sorts of different things. There's
Yeah.
a movie down the one way. You know, there's dogs chasing a bone, and you know
Yeah.
the guy's chasing the bone because it's his bone actually.
It's a really cute movie. And it's Halloween, so it's a good time to see it.
Halloween was
Halloween was yes, yeah. Technically, if you still want to get away with it, right?
But it's still Day of the Dead, so.
Indeed.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it?
Day of Dead is-
Today?
It was yesterday and today.
Oh, there you go. So you could still go home and
No,
watch it.
it's James
Ah.
Bond.
No, it's October 3rd.
It's cute. It's really
When
good.
I go home, I
Google.
upload my videos that I'm making,
Mhm.
and I post what notes I remember from the class and
Mhm.
send it out to you. I'll be done by around 3 a.m.
Oh
something,
gosh.
which is that's just my normal Friday.
Yeah, I have to say probably similar here. I'm not an early bird.
I really get excited about this class, so it takes me a while to unwind afterwards.
Gotcha. Good thing
Mostly
it's
because
Friday.
I'm upset that I didn't do everything I had hoped I would do. You know, hoping to be actually wow you guys with just erudite knowledge and
So I looked up, just back up for a second, I looked up the Golden Gate Bridge information. I was curious. The net, can anybody guess how much it cost?
oh gosh.
Oh my god.
Oh, it's because it's not
Is that a
just a
quiz
net,
question?
it's the
Could be a quiz
structure
question.
too.
Did you say 20 million?
20 million.
Okay, you gotta keep going.
Wow, 200 million.
211 million.
For the net?
Yeah.
That's
This is why nothing's
crazy.
done in California. It's 9,000 feet on, down total, okay?
Mhm.
That's fleet.
It's 20 feet down, 20 feet out, it's a stainless steel wire. Okay. Guess how much the original bridge cost in 1933?
Oh, less than that, I bet.
2 million.
200,000.
37 million, adjusted for inflation, is 709 million. So the net cost,
More than the bridge.
one third the cost of the bridge today.
Yeah.
Wow.
You said it's 20 feet wide,
Yeah.
so that'd be really hard to jump.
You're not clearing that.
It looked pretty short, so I'm sure it can.
But that's why you can't have anything nice in California.
Yeah, it's that dang net saving lives. Saving lives, people who want to die.
And it's not even done, so its price is gonna go up, you know that.
Yeah.
But they didn't clean the brush, it all went to the net.
And then think of maintenance contracts.
Yeah, no
That
kidding.
didn't lose cost, it eats right through the steel.
Do remember though that we should be treating suicide very seriously, because it is.
Right.
And I've been critiqued for almost joking about suicide, so not joking about suicide. That's me. That's the way I, when things are most stressful, that's when I tell the most jokes, because that's
Yeah.
my retreat.
Makes
I don't know.
sense.
I wouldn't joke about it, I can tell you that,
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
record.
Yes.
Wow. So I assume they did just research and calculated how many people were jumping off this bridge, and if they put this net up, how many lives they could save, and that's how they
Apparently
came to
it's
that
worked.
conclusion.
You do that in, what was it,
So
China?
if they wanna do it, they'd have to go somewhere else, not this bridge particularly.
And they don't want other bridges.
Apple iPhones.
There was
They want
something
that one.
romantically drawing
That
them
factory
to
for-
die on that bridge. And so
Okay.
once they couldn't,
That's where
they didn't go to other bridges.
Interesting, okay,
That's Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, I'm just
right, quoting that, yeah.
quoting, I mean, the best thing, of course, is to read the book yourself,
Right.
rather than take my word for it. I just try to encourage people to,
Like, right.
whatever. Okay, so we should take a break, I suppose,
Yeah.
and then move on to the second portion of our doubleheader. Thinking of the seventh game of the Nats versus the Houston Astros.
It's been
What
a
sport?
for a while now. It's
I'm really bad.
Baseball.
Okay.
I got to see the last pitch.
they
We were all sitting there at the bar watching the last of the game. So it's pretty interesting. Wednesday night.
Ask for, X amount of dollars.